Hello, everyone. Thanks for your tuning in. Today's episode has a special significance, and it is an idea that, in some sense, has visited me anew. The title is "Freedom from Self-Proclaimed Innocence," and so in the subtitle, I've written "Broken Thought Shells." And so I would like to speak about uh, how can I say it? Our ideological senses of being are like shells that we are living in. We are in some sense spiraling into our own conceivable domains. You see, when I try to see reality all in one dimension, everything being present at once, there immediately comes a sort of strange equality between every dimension where the value for, think of it this way, it's like instead of the person valuing their hand for its utility or valuing their feet for its specific utility, imagine they just see the whole thing as the body, as if the significance of the individual realities are not taken into consideration. So in some sense, there's this saying from St. Augustine that goes something like, "It is in dying to self that we are born to eternal life." And so this dying of self is a sort of an acknowledgement of how the individual notion exists. And there's always a codependence between individuality and collectivity. So anyways, what I'm trying to say is that if we choose to see things as just one thing, then many dimensions are not authorized to be perceived. Many viewpoints will never enter the mind of the person because everything is in some sense seen through one mold of a moment. So let's begin with this consideration that in every moment of existence, there is an objective component and a subjective component. The objective component is very obvious. Just look at your physical body right now. The subjective component has to do with how this physical body is in some sort of animated acknowledgement of itself. Now, self-proclaimed innocence has to do with the conditioning, or in another way of saying it, how the world spoon feeds to you reality. Self-proclaimed innocence is a suggestion that in some sense the person in a limited usually tends to be an internal reality. They have attained certain values, yet the values have not been externalized. Sometimes the mind wants something so quick, the being wants something so quickly that it's as if the mind is already there. The body, there's a delay for the body to get there. The instantaneity of the mind is kind of like as unique as like when somebody is driving, like when you drive a car, your attention goes in front of the car, like meters in front of the car. Your attention is there, kind of acknowledging the environment, the setting you're going in. That ahead, that kind of like attention before a phenomena happens, is where the significance of the mind comes in, and the mind, in some sense, functions through time. For me, because language is a sort of linguistic simulation, I see it as a sort of technology. Right now, these words am I saying, I personally, based on my own experiential awareness of this, I cannot, like, no person can be a word. Okay, and if not, in some sense, ideology cannot replace the experience of reality. It can only contain it in various ways, which provides various utility. So when you look at a language, or when you look at the evolution of language on this planet, something many people don't know is that language, people in the same country, um, like, how would I say it? It was nationalism that brought a sort of singular language among all the villages of one nation. You see, it's as if we weren't speaking the same language. There was a sort of scattering of inner realities. Language allowed was a bridge between people's inner realities. As the tribal dynamics occurred in history, pretty much human beings went into tribes. Their inner realities began mixing with one another. And as it mixed with one another, we suddenly discovered a new potential. It's as if people started no longer just caring for themselves, they started caring for the tribe. In doing so, their mind began wondering what is not just best for them, what is best for all. So in some sense, you can say the intelligence of the being. Um, there's a moment that right now, within this moment, there is a sort of chaotic emptiness and an ordered fullness to phenomena. Your intelligence is actually acknowledging both. That means a part of your mind is trying to conceive existence, and a part of your mind is trying to conceive non existence. The issue with granting objectivity the final say, the final position of intelligence, the only issue is that you will never know if there's something more. That is the sort of strange and at times unnecessary power of a belief. If the action is the right action, your belief has results. But if the action is the wrong action, it doesn't matter what you believe. Have you noticed this? So, in some sense, suggesting a relationship where values of correctness or what is good and bad are being, in some sense, imposed in a subtle way, put into the objective phenomena. So what that means is objectivity exists to be a thought, thoughts exist to be objective. A thought, what's the greatest value of a thought? These words that you're hearing right now, what is their greatest value? I mean, aside from how your mind animates or brings forth an image behind your eyes, aside from that, its value is in the action that inspires. The self-proclaimed innocence part has to do, again, I'm going to kind of dive into a more zoomed in version of what I feel happens in childhood for pretty much generally all human beings. You see, the child exists through a dependency on its environment. It does not understand the conditions of its environment, but it has no other choice, unconditionally trust it. Because it's an existential phenomena tends, at least intelligent living beings, tend to center themselves. It's not just that the world has a center of gravity. Every ideology that has entered your mind has entered your orbit. The child is dependent on the world. The child needs the parents or some sort of guardian figure to continue to even its physical existence to be maintained. Now, because there's this dependency, the child is walking in a world where, as long as it still feels it can be dependent, chaos cannot touch it. And hence the naivety of childhood. So the dependency of the mind depends on acknowledging something to be there for it. You know, the thing is, as the child grows up and actually goes into society, what happens is, because it's been, how can I tell you, because it's kind of like been fed, it has this mentality that the inner reality, the way the child sees the world, it must be that way. You see, this is why when you take a toy away from a child, the child cries. The child is like, "Ah, my God, heaven, they took away heaven." And suddenly you bring the toy back, heaven is back. This dependency on the environment is kind of like the person getting angry. And you know how some people say karma, for example, excuse my language, but they say karma is a bitch. You know, I've heard like many people say that. Now, when the person says something like that, that's because the world has not listened to their eyes. And there's a kind of advantage and disadvantage, because when the world doesn't listen to your eyes, the person, the individual, the entity, the intelligent being suddenly notices that what it is holding as valid is not the only thing that's valid. See, there's two ways things can become invalid. They either become invalid by either the idea being rejected, so as if there is a positive point, then a negative point comes and takes away that positive point. But then there's a way of an idea becomes invalid where it has to do with the dimensions that are being added. Suddenly, as more dimensions are added, the macrocosmic picture makes the microcosmic minute in value. That means it's like when an asteroid is about to hit Earth, it's as if like the person in that sense, in that inevitable kind of circumstance, doesn't have to, will have an easy day. Like the person won't do a lot. It's as if you see, we are so outcome dependent. It's phenomenal. Our species has to do with the outcome it sees. Now, the important thing about life, where I find that, like many times, one of my biggest questions, even it remains till today, it's like every moment, any person who I feel like has a unique attention to reality, I in some sense ask them, and I ask them, does free will exist? And it is a question which is very, even many mystics, their mind never touches that question, because they feel their free will has to do something. When you feel you have to do something, you never wonder about how you're being. Kind of like before the person has a chance to see who the enemy is, it's as if the village is under siege and he has to fight. It's as if in the action there is the denial of the presence from a still and static state of how the world is kept. In some sense, the mind is moving towards the animations of life. This self-proclaimed innocence is the attachment to the inner life of the individual based on dependent conditions, which is not the actual inner life of the individual. For example, in myself, it's not only I've seen it in my childhood, even it happened even very recently. I had a situation where, because of my own lack of energetic expression, because I didn't want to do something, my mind was in some sense convinced that the other could do it in some sense. Like how would I say it to you? It was I pretty much got angry in a store, you know. But what I realized was that the moment the person feels they have violated their own context of morality, it's as if something that people don't realize. So many people think that they are their thoughts, that if you change their thought, they get offended. Literally, you take away the toy from their attention, the toy that they've been thinking their whole life they are, and suddenly the person goes chaotic, you know? As if, imagine your ego is like this next level rug in your house, and you're like, lying on this rug. Suddenly you see the rug being pulled and you just feeling, the wooden floor. The intelligence suddenly sees there is something missing out of the normal way it kept itself. Now, the interesting thing is, guys, that there's only two things to study in this life. There's only two things to study in this life, and that is known conscious phenomena and unknown conscious phenomena. What that means is you pretty much learn from the known and the unknown. After you've learned from knowledge, I don't know how common. I don't have the eyes uh, of all human beings on this earth, but I do share a common existential design. And so when I look at this existential design, I see how just like I wear clothes, you know, similarly how I dress myself, I also dress myself ideologically based on how my mind expects itself to be. You know, I kind of realized a second life behind my eyes. That second life behind my eyes was a narrative. That narrative existed because I felt the ethos of the environment, the inspirations of my environment were forcing it to be there. You know, there has been some ideas I have rebelled against, and I have seen that I have been the tyrant in rebelling against that idea. And there's been moments where I've rebelled, and if I hadn't, I wouldn't have forgiven myself. And so it's as if there's various the world moves in various ways. You see, it's like um, it's at first you studying what is known externally, and then what is unknown externally, and then when you get to what is unknown externally, you begin to wonder about what is known internally, and then you get to what is unknown internally. It's like that the kind of playful enlightenment route, at least in this context, is like a Z from individual consciousness to individual to collective consciousness, and in some sense, from individual consciousness to individual unconsciousness, and then from individual unconsciousness to collective consciousness, and then from collective consciousness to, in some sense, collective unconscious. Do you know what that means? That means in the evolutionary scheme of a human of the human being, it's as if kind of designed naturally to at first experience itself as an individual. Then it's going to, in some sense, after like dwelling in for eons in the program of the known individual, it begins to wonder about, in some sense, the unknown intelligence of the individual. When you get to the unknown, when you're wondering how individuality is just here, then your mind has nowhere else to go. You reach a sort of, again, I say the edge of the language threshold. The language threshold is a very important concept that I was kind of like trying to conceptualize, um, like, you know, various thoughts I was exposed to in the history and of psychology and philosophy, and I was trying to assimilate these. And then I constantly thought how to, in some sense, it's as if, like, think of it this way. Um, there was this is a very playful story, but the story is, it's as if this guy, this street smart kind of son of a business merchant, you know, suddenly realized they heard some talks about enlightenment and whatnot. And so this street start summer merchant was like, okay, let me see, let me see what this all means, and what is the street smart person, their whole inspiration is to be ahead. There's some people on this planet, it's kind of very playful when you see them. It's as if their whole existence is inspired of being ahead. It's as if there was not a arena of competition, they would not know who they are. The working man brings many gifts to the world, but in the process burdens himself. This street smart kind of son of a bit like a merchant back in the day, he looks at this situation, he wonders about enlightenment, and he says, all this knowledge that the human beings has, what does it have in common? You see, it's about a permission to see in another way, but you don't choose how it's another way. It's kind of a trust of the moment in how it happens. So what I'm trying to say is, eventually you're going to realize the common denominator of every branch of knowledge and the academic and educational system has its common denominator is pretty much the relationship of that human being with the words. You see, this is a foreign concept to many, but many people are indirectly worshiping ideas. Not even like when I say indirectly, is as if the person is looking at the wrong statue of the is looking at a statue of a god. Imagine there's two statues of like two different gods. The person is looking at the wrong statue, but is thinking that statue is that god. Do you see? It's a sort of indirect worship of of the, like, do you know what I mean? The person's doing the right thing without knowing it is the right thing, or doing the wrong thing without knowing it's the right thing. We have these kind of dynamics uh, visible in this just study of human behavior. Pretty much the street smart merchant realizes every human being is playing with phenomena. Their attention is existing within phenomena, which a certain aspect, a certain amount of it can move. You see, I really wondered about who I was as a being. And I was convinced by many stories, kind of bombarded by them, you know? And the dangers of culture is that it can make you believe in the wrong ideology. When the child realizes how important its environment is to its thinking, it will, in some sense, try to move towards a natural kind of approach. There's ways your intelligence works that it doesn't matter what level of sophisticated, like mechanical, electronic, kind of digital technology we had. It's like there's a way the human being can naturally be where its intelligence is not defined by a sort of reference of progress. Its intelligence is defined based on how it abides, in some sense, with the living world. This is the domain of when mysticism and spirituality and pretty much the wonders of who the being is. Your parents give you a name. The world gives you a shape, gives you a self. This sense of self is dependent, is based on conditions, but eventually has to acknowledge an unconditional acknowledgement. Okay, guys, there was this truck making incredible amounts of noise. Anyways, I'll continue. The philosophers of this world have always had a challenge. When it has come to right and wrong and morality and the decisions upon what to base morality of, there has always been a sort of subjective, how can I tell you, there's a sort of subjective, um, okay, I think the truck's gone. All I'm trying to say is the subjective realm is a world in a world. It appears to be a world in a world, uh, which is in some sense preserved by attention. When we study the attention, we shift our intelligence from a personality to a presence. It just happens automatically. When you suddenly are present with the world, something unique happens. Most people think that they have to be something every moment of their life, and they feel they have to be something special, which is kind of like the story the world is selling them. To be something in a changing world is kind of like you deciding to wear one shirt. Like, imagine you were like 5 years old and you wear that same shirt as you're growing up. It's like eventually you will move beyond its dimensions. Life will change in ways where you will not be the same person to even be in the same moment. So when nature is suggesting that our objectivity is changing, it also means subjectivity changes. And believe it or not, thoughts move, like live and die in the attention of people at faster speeds. They move in the attention of the being at faster speeds than matter, you know? It's like as you heat up, the ice. Oh my god, this truck is doing its work, but at the same time. Okay, let's bring it into the talk. Maybe I should say something about technology. Whether the spirit is in the machine or the machine is in some sort of unknown spiritual position. The attention cannot be contained in thought. Your memories, your idea, your views on the future, anything that can be written down in some sense can be said to be in the in the linguistic realm of the intelligence of the being. Phenomena that goes beyond the linguistic realm, there's no words for it. Kind of like that moment where like an explorer finds a new land and is suddenly realizing that it must attempt to, in some sense, relate it to the world it knows. The issue with, I find, a logical and rational approach to life is that it doesn't, it's like valid only in one dimension. The dervish, the Sufi mystics, just like how Gnosticism is a kind of spiritual version of, Christianity, we can say in some sense Sufism is a sort of spiritual version of Islam, you know. And what I'm trying to say there is that in the Sufi tradition, they had this saying, this popular saying, where they would say to seek the path of truth with only the intellect is like whipping a dead donkey to go faster. That means there is a sort of breaking of meaning and then trying to find the meaning where it kind of limits you because you have changed the moment. Scientists are very concerned about evidence, but the issue with evidence is not that the evidence is true or false. The issue is that the person's view of what true and false means shifts as the person experiences. Do you see the show of the world? In ancient traditions, and let's jump to the Vedic kind of tradition. In uh, there's this notion in yoga where the person, in their cultivation of their attention and their true nature, in some sense, suddenly realizes that gets a deeper insight into the games of the world. The games of the world, first, the person has to consider them external. You see, your physical body needs to continue and to survive. But very playfully, I'm saying this, if our species, like 400 years from now, was somehow here, what it would be like is human beings would not have minds. The concept of a mind would in some sense have been faded by then. Intelligence at its core must choose to be attributeless in order to connect with the new. That means sometimes it is only because you're in a temporary position you can kind of wonder about an eternal gaze. You know, only in a sort of temporary sort of design of a life. St. Augustine could say, for example, um, to in dying to to die to self is kind of like to be born. Uh, oh my God, the full quote doesn't come to me now. To die to self is to be born to eternal life, something like that. The dervishes, Sufi dervishes, had another way of saying. They said you had to die before you die, and some people were like, "Whoa, what do you mean die before I die?" And the Sufi dervishes weren't like, it's like it doesn't. It has nothing to do with your physical positioning. It has to do that after your physical existence came into form, there eventually came into position a conceptual existence. This psychologists say it is like by the age of 14, where the child's mind gets ready to step out of the fields of dependency and to no longer be defined by a condition, but to start defining conditions. This is where the personality of the person is kind of raised from the dirt. It's kind of like a attribute of our free will. You see, your free will means that you can move something. By moving something, you are being defined by what is found in that attention. The issue with dialogue and just discourse and just communication is that it is not a perfect technology, and at the same time, we shouldn't want it to be a perfect technology. You know. If the person chooses and in some sense has to maintain at least financial survival, you have to entertain your individual consciousness. To entertain your individual consciousness is a sort of view, like fundamentally what philosophy and history comes down to, guys, is pretty much what human beings saw when they were alive. And how alive a person is, a person's greatness, true strength is not a sort of just the person kind of grunting, you know? It's not an egoic grunt. so many people don't understand power. They don't understand strength, you know? They don't understand courage simply because they have a conditional outtake on it. The thing is that the person suddenly realizes, oh my God, I'm alive once. Every day happens once. Honestly, it's kind of like a candle, our lifetimes. It's like this candle, the consciousness is lit into a sort of existence. And based on its dynamism and direction, its existence manifests in different ways. Sometimes your karma has to do in where you decide to walk. It's like some people are like, Lords of Karma, why do you do this to me? And the Lords of Karma were like, bro, we're your own mind. Don't take it seriously. Mythology has an incredible power. Ideology, eventually you're going to learn from yourself, but not your ideological self, your self of selves. Your self of selves becomes you're trying to find the keeper of your memories and your imagination. You see, you are primarily identified. I'm saying you, but I have to speak about it somehow. Like, yeah. So anybody listening to this, don't take this personally. I don't know you, but I'm just speaking about the human design, the human condition. When you reverse engineer ignorance, you come away from a complex unauthorization to simpler authorizations. Pretty much many negotiations, and I consider it very advanced external modes of communication, pretty much like businessmen in boardrooms who are talking and in some sense conversing, negotiating contracts and whatnot. What that is suggesting is it's like, of course, there is a sort of self-proclaim of righteousness there, you know. Two warriors who are holding swords and they find their swords hitting one another must choose to fight for something. That's the thing. The warrior guys, this was the mentality of the warrior. Pretty much you pick something up and charge efficiently. That means you find whatever tool is accessible, which sometimes might mean a sort of philosophical position. It could sometimes mean various things. The mind is very playful. I say the mind is multidimensional in its essence, in its essential nature, and the body is in some sense in one dimension. It has to be. It's cooler that way. You know, to conceive that we have limit, the sense of self changes, the claim upon the reality changes. How you are owning the world to be you changes because the one owning is wondering about what it is truly owning. You see, there's something where no writer to this point has been able to communicate, but they have all seen something. I feel every person, every grand writer who was trying to kind of scoping their civilization's health and maintenance in some sense. We have to keep truth distant. This is why many people, religious doctrines, the reason many people suddenly moved away from it, you know. But let me tell you something hilarious. This life is kind of goes back and forth. It oscillates, it vibrates. Because it vibrates, it doesn't matter what moment of karma you find yourself, it's going back and forth constantly. It's like a wave. So when you treat your karma like a wave, you stop expecting it to be a certain way. Believe it or not, you have to free yourself from ideas that are kind of like boxes you haven't taken off your head. But where does that freedom lead? If you are materialistically oriented, I'm afraid I'm going to tell you any deep question you ask will take you towards nihilism. You know, this is why when you ask a scientist a question starting with why, the scientist is like, get out of my classroom. Simply because it will lead to nihilism, objectively. Pretty much we are just chemicals, and the movement of atoms is being the hallucination of a temporary human life. So the challenge comes, how does one free their self from themselves? You know, from like, how do you free yourself from yourself? They say the mind is a trickster, and even in religious traditions, they say, like, you know, the bad guy's out there to get you. It's like, honestly, evil cannot destroy good, and good cannot destroy evil. They never will, because in some sense they are dependent on one another to be defined into a mode of existence. Pretty much we're just creatures on a rock, and as things are changing, the experience of the moment is regenerating its values. For me, when I sleep, and it's not just when I sleep, every moment, whatever happens to me, it's very important. Now, what I mean by that, for me, I'm saying, for me, it's important. Let me tell you why, though. You know, because when you suddenly realize nobody can teach you about an intelligence that is within you, like nobody can teach you behind your what's behind your eyes. The best thing they can do is give you a mirror. This is why I say these, everything I have ever said and anything you have ever said, you have heard me say in these talks, they are a mirror of your mind. Do you see? I am in some sense in I am walking in realities that my experiences, you know, shined upon, and the same with you. Eventually, mystical self-inquiry transforms into just a sort of acceptance, a natural acceptance. You accept how nature is moving, and suddenly your mind is freed from any sort of resistance it had. You know, there's a very profound argument that could be made for any person who thinks that morality has to have a special story to it. The thing is, I find that ideology, the moment we make it too personal, the moment we create a sort of doctrine or ideology that is based on like a character, the moment we see anything that resembles human designs, we get emotions for it. You know, when a pet owner sees their pet kind of like snore, you know, suddenly they feel like as if they're seeing their child, like a child snore. Do you see? So it's as if that we suddenly acknowledge what our mind is familiar with. Okay, anything beyond this scope of familiarity, we ignore, or the attention doesn't see, or it still remains in the unconscious. I need to find this quote from Carl Jung because it's too good not to share. Here's the quote. Carl Jung says, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. So that's the importance of it. There's a sort of, as if imagine your sight, just everything that your sensory data is being the awareness of right now. This is the spotlight of your attention. So, in some sense, we see the whole religious idea, the game that religion gives society moral wise, is to become conscious of action, but it does it in strict ways, you know? You know, it's like in one sense, scientists are telling people, like children, imagine like a young child comes and asks a scientist, you know, in one way they're open, their eyes, the child's eyes are opened to a world where there could be infinite explorations of the physical universe. So in some sense it's very interesting. The religious man is worshiping a god that is beyond the world and inconceivable. The non-religious, the secular mind, pretty much it's like it's just human beings' attention, and the attention of the human being is on matter. So matter is the god of the secular, because it is what is defining everything. And for religion, it's the subjective kind of positioning of the ideology. So how that language is there. So a very profound question. I just wondered this about myself. See, I was raised, like till the age of 7, like in Iran, you know. And I lived and came to Canada, and then I was here for some years, and then I went back to Iran for a few years, 2 3 years there, and then I came back to Canada, you know. And I've just been visiting every like couple years. There was a religious influence in the society. There was a sort of false behavior enforced by the environment in people's minds, that it was like the inner censorship of authenticity. The privilege of the luxury of the mind is only freedom, because freedom entails within it the attainable. Like, it's as if what happens in the unknown is not just like a miracle. The miracle has to do with how your attention is there. The personal dimension, the inner reality, it has an infinite edge. I kind of explain human existence sometimes as another way I've kind of spoken about it is, um, it's an empty infinity, the concept of an empty infinity. I've written like a lot about this. I've talked about this in other talks before. This was a concept that in some sense I put that term maybe like a few years ago. I came up with the term, but it was inspired out of my childhood experience when I was in Iran, where in my house there was there was in some sense a closet that would open, like the doors of it would open inside, from the inside, and the doors were both mirrors. So, and it was this kind of very long closet. So I suddenly found myself between these two mirrors, just as a young child. I don't know, let's say like, I don't know how old I was, probably like 6 or something, I don't know. Like, anyways, the thing was, I think I was older than 6. But anyways, like, I saw myself between two mirrors, and I saw a sensory optical illusion. I saw like my reflections go to a kind of curving vanishing point. I saw my reflection between two mirrors going to a curved vanishing point, you know? And it was fun, very interesting, because that's how it was an optical illusion, because something in the sensory suddenly did not have a continuity, a rational continuity. I mean, when I say rational continuity, I mean it's like sensory wise, it's an optical illusion. You know, an optical illusion is like a miracle of sight. You know, but kind of artificial miracle. You know. So I saw a sort of infinite reflection of myself between those two mirrors, and this kind of curving infinite reflection, and the idea of the empty infinity was born, which in a more deeper context later on, what that idea implied to me was that my most infinite excitement and vision and aspiration of any sort of infinitude, whether it's on a physical domain, the person wants to be immortal, or if it's on a subjective domain, the person wants to be eternal, or if it's beyond the clouds of the subjective life. Imagine what is behind you, behind your eyes, is a sort of subjective infinitude, as if you can stare into this abyss of how reality it has been contained as a memory. You can study your attention, how it brings up memories, how as it shifts, as like concentration is a sort of, if you look at true meditation, it's not just the person does whatever. It had to do with a sort of calibration of concentration, a calibration of attention, and the person concentrating on a singular point. Meditation, it were people who were trying to find the vanishing point of physical reality, but because they were externally driven, the poor person had to go act like a kind of like the person had to go live the spiritual life without realizing the spiritual life has nothing to do with external. There was, so behind our eyes, infinite emptiness. In front of our eyes, infinite fullness. The personality wavers between these. I'm going to share some intents of certain so considered realized people. Sri Ramana Maharshi tells us, let go what goes. Let come what comes. See what remains. Rumi has this quote where he says, I have lived on the edge of insanity. Rumi is this ancient Persian poet from 700 years ago or something. He was a Sufi dervish. Uh, Rumi says, I have lived on the edge of insanity, wanting to know reasons, knocking on a door. The door opens. I have been knocking from the inside. Pretty much he's saying the greatest finding of his external journey was that it was a reflection of his inner being. Your inner being is not like some sort of soul, like a Casper movie where some ghost is like, okay, I'm done with this, moves on to the next life. It's not like a, it's not like a show like that. I find that nature is much more brilliant to convince us only in one way it exists. Innocence or whatever. And when the self drives it, like you got to see what thought is filtering, or in some sense being a sort of position where meaning is being reflected. Your attention is like the center of gravity for any thought or any sort of memory or imagination that comes to you. The mind is present in such a significant way. The reason I'm so openly saying this is because I'm like, oh my God, what are neurologists studying? I think they're so bored. I think neurologists are extremely bored because for how long? For how long can you just look at a brain? You know? Where the attention goes, the inner world of the person tends to follow. This is because the inner reality is not made aware of fully, so the person doesn't care for some things in this life, but will eventually realize everything in the moment is being their mind. So, how your expression as a being becomes has to do with how alert and aware you are in regards to where you are. That disruptance I kind of brought forth, that happened when I was in a store, and in some sense anger and intolerance emerged in my mind. um, I was not aware. My attention was stolen by my future uh, assumption. It's as if sometimes when you plan things ahead too much, you live like a robot. I'm not kidding. It's because it's so well structured. You know, sometimes you need a bit of clutter for sanity. Think of it this way. It's as if you completely go to the extreme edges of order, the intelligence will feel insane. You know, if you go completely towards the edges of chaos, the intelligence will feel insane. This is why Buddha said, walk the middle way. You know, in the Lotus Sutra, there's this saying, this Buddhic text. It's kind of like a very unique denomination of Buddhism. And in the Lotus Sutra, it says, keep your mind alive and free without abiding in anywhere or anything. Now, just to give a context to this, your mind is your attention. It's your present attention in the waking state. You know, when it says keep your mind alive and free, that means realize how the attention and the free will are being an instant expression. And then it says, keep your mind alive and free without abiding in anywhere or anything. This implies, do not try to find a condition for the unconditional. You cannot find there's no map to truth. You know? It's as if the species can play better games. The map to the mind, like the exploration of the subtler planes and the subconscious and the unconscious and the various divisions of this. I'm not saying that the mind should not be explored, but I'm saying beliefs are very dangerous. Any sort of belief, because it can consume your life. Do you see? So, if a belief is dangerous, what should the person believe in? And Mr. Within is saying, for one moment in your life, just watch life. You don't have to believe anything. You know, you don't have to always be a sort of strict relationship with phenomena. This is when the presence of the person opens their wings of Satchidananda. This is when suddenly your mind reverts into how it's a field of intelligence rather than just a particle in a field. The more separate, the more unique, the more special the person makes the image of themselves, the more luxurious and like the more they update their ego. Do you know what happens at the end? It's as if the person's been spending their whole lifetime to make a cake and suddenly the cake falls. It's like you have it out of the oven, you have it on the tray, you're about to put it on the table, and somehow gravity's like, hell no. And suddenly, like, the cake falls. You know? What it means is, and a Zen version of saying the same thing was Zen Master Dogen was known to say, I don't know if it was Suzuki or Dogen. I don't know who it was who said this. But it's the saying where it says kind of life is like you build a boat and then you swim in the middle of the ocean and suddenly it's as if things turn off. we are kind of thought being matter and matter being thought at the same time. When a person has a dream, like when they're asleep and they have a dream, and in that dream, who they are can move. Literally, they want to go left, they can go left, right. This suggests, in some sense, how thought is being matter. And in some sense, when we wake up and are in the waking state, matter is being thought. And in some sense, there is a sort of like triangular Venn diagram to this, you know. This triangular Venn diagram is like the three different states of an existential phenomena and how there's a central state. Just a second, guys, I'm writing something down. No. Okay. There's this notion in the Reboot Gita, this Vedic text. Um, it says the human being experiences three, kind of three states of conscious. There's like three states to reality. But in some sense, there says there is suddenly a fourth state. These three states are, of course, deep sleep, waking state, and the dream state. These three dynamics, like literally, the life of the person is just the majority of their intelligence is just being defined by their waking state. Okay. The dream state we consider it as a fabrication, so we don't care for its data. But I find that dreams are, in some sense, strangely just how the mind is moving in new ways. But there was this fourth state, and the fourth state was the witness. And the witness was kind of like, imagine like I use the term, this is something cool I can add. I use the term the pilot of consciousness. It's kind of like a sort of ideology I've come up with personally. The way I use those terms, it's a sort of like kind of the next position, what's left for the human being to do, and externally we build technology and we moved beyond the clouds of our vision, and so similarly we're trying to do the same thing internally. What that means is suddenly instead of thinking people are meditators, non-meditators, whatever, we suddenly see every human being as a pilot of their consciousness. Their free will is a navigation of their attention as an intelligent moment. So, because I use the term pilot of consciousness, I want to use the image where it's the propeller, you know? And so the propeller is how these three different states have one center. The wings of the each side of the propeller has a central point they're connected to. What that means is it's like one moment that is experienced. It's like the same substance being in a solid state, liquid state, gas state. Okay. The liquid state is the dream state. The solid state is the waking state. The deep sleep state is the gas state, as if you can't see gas and it's when it's really, I mean, beyond steam, you know. So the nature of phenomena comes to the nature of the attention of the being. A true and a person who truly loves language, it's like you get some things you gotta hate first before you can really love. You know, I truly believe in that. You know, some people you hate the most, if you stick around a bit longer, you will eventually see different sides to them. You know, that was the whole point of marriage, which is kind of forgotten nowadays. It was this notion that marriage was not two people are locked together in just one prison cell. You know, it's not. It's not like it's not a contract that is illegal. Like it, even though marriage is a legal binding. But I'm saying it's like it's not a sort of uh, cage that the two people are in. Rather than seeing marriage as a cave, the sort of ancient, the true value of marriage was in some sense two human beings who liked each other enough that they were willing to exist in the same moment, to have their attention, to see different dimensions of each other, you know? It's like, why do we see in so many of her movies? It's like the dude loves the girl, and the dude jumps in front of like something to save the girl, you know. And that's like the true love of the guy. He could never share his emotions. He had to be a tough guy, but suddenly that moment came. He became like vulnerable, you know. And the notion is that there are deeper dimensions, and wherever your attention goes, you will eventually see more out of. If you see the same person every day, you're seeing different versions of that person. Literally, when you see that person, your mind has various views on that person, you know. And the best, I think, advice that can be given to people uh, is that the wheel of karma, its center doesn't move. The center of the wheel of karma cannot move, it's a point. But the wheel of karma moves. And we, like, kind of, at least how Buddhic thought I find has kind of approached it so far, is that it's on, like, you know, in the middle of the wheel. It's not at the center and it's not at the end. We are not the most inferior species at the same time, you know. We are not at the same time the most superior. Vedic mythology would even acknowledge it, that this human dimension, this plane of existence, is the bottom of this sort of very profound metaphysical mountain, and each level of the mountain is like a different loka, is like a Brahma loka, Vishnu loka, like the different realms of how collective intelligence is being acknowledged. So your sense of self is a courtesy of your plane of existence. You know, it's like something complimentary. You know, you go to sit on a plane, they give you complimentary, you know, apple juice and orange juice. You know, the great service of the plane. Data comes with this life, and data moves, and so do you. And the definitions that arise from this movement that is life, it's not something per se that could have like a ideological purpose. It's too dynamic. This life is too dynamic. The attention is moving in so many various ways that it can't just be contained in one way. It's as if, like, what is the idea of slavery? So the idea of slavery is literally the person is chained to a reality they cannot evolve beyond. It's a sort of dismissal of their evolution. You see, it's like a lack of freedom. It's as if the person cannot exist naturally, so they are kept unnaturally. So an enslavement, you can say, is an attention, is an attachment. So subjectively, we consider this. I think it's fair to say it could be mental enslavement if the person is thinking of something in a certain way where that thought has never changed. Sometimes knowledge doesn't have to do with like the content you with the books. It doesn't have to do with how many books you read or whatever. It has to do with how much you want to know what's going on, honestly. And you will automatically kind of be pulled towards the philosopher's table. So thought shells will break, senses of self will change. How the ego is today is not how it was yesterday and is not how it is going to be tomorrow. This makes the person be playful, and rather than being defined by a moment, you know, they be like in their past, they become defined by how the present is just being here. There's a very grand comfort that comes to this. Most people, any person who's shy to speak to other people is also shy to know their deeper intelligence, because the personalized condition does not allow the exploration of the unknown. Like, legit, the person is too sure. The person is so convinced of their truth that how could there be anything else? I've had moments where I've behaved like, literally in my life, I felt that was an inefficient moment, like I did the wrong thing. And afterwards, like, there came this sort of feeling of like, why did I behave so uh, inefficiently? And it's as if I've had in those moments, especially when you're any child that's raised in a religious context, they are kind of taught to love God. So what that means is, when everything is gone, there is at least the creator there. Freud, in a book where I can't remember the title, I think it's The Future of a Dream or whatever, I don't know. But in his writings, he talks about how, because as long as human beings are afraid of death, they will need a ruler, they will need a god. So the idea of God cannot go unless the notion of death goes. Because death is where change of reality moves towards more of the chaos. It's where there's this kind of like Japanese show called Ghost in the Shell. There's a movie of it too. This Ghost in the Shell, it's pretty much about artificial life. And the ghost in the shell, or we can say the ghost in a shell of thought, in an ideological shell, in a linguistic simulation, is where man finds his eyes currently. I can't find this. I'm looking for this quote, guys, which is honestly an incredible quote. For me, kind of these quotes are like they have a sort of archaeological wonder about. Oh, there we go. I found the quote. The quote is from Will Durant, and it's an incredible sentence. For me, language is architecture, and this is one of the most phenomenal structures of language. It's one of the most incredible sentences I've seen. You know, as incredible as that Carl Jung kind of quote. He says, "Knowledge is the eye of desire, and can become the pilot of the soul." Knowledge is the eye of desire and can become the pilot of the soul. That means the free will's openness to know means it's as if the attention of the being from an individual desire bound kind of realm moves towards a sort of collective field. The greatest desire is to know the truth. Even in relationships, when something goes wrong, one member comes and says, "Tell me the truth." And so, in some sense, the eye of desire, where desire takes the attention of the being, you know, is the process of knowing, which is knowledge. And in the fruition of this recognition, kind of you realizing the edge of your desire. The beyond is too incredible to be defined. May mankind's attention go where language could just get us there, you know. When we see language as a tool, as a technology, you, in some sense, establish a relationship of its existence based on utility. As if the lion doesn't go kill like 20 gazelle and just store it, you know? It eats when it's hungry. The tool, the roar comes out when it is necessary. Kind of like the warrior sheaths his weapon, his sword. Back in the day, imagine the samurai, unless it was necessary. You are free when you realize kind of like you're free before you were a self to even consider what freedom is. That is what the natural field of intelligence of this universal sector begins to feel like as one is drawn to the mysteries of how light is emerging as the existence of mind experientially. These are very important things to consider, honestly. There are outer technologies and there are inner technologies, and the best inner technologies for now we find is like pretty much how the linguistic simulation is here. Without this linguistic simulation, the individual could not have a story to it. It's as if our attention is infused with the language that is keeping it in a certain way. But the truth is, the intelligence is able beyond its measurement. What that means is a drop might have difficulty in trying to remember how it was a drop, when it's in the whole ocean, being the ocean. It's a sort of uh, disappearance of the appearance of your beliefs. Something like that. So anyways, guys, thanks for tuning in. And I'm going to share one more quote about uh, uh, I guess, piloting the soul. Walter Raleigh says the engine is the heart of an airplane, but the pilot is its soul. There's this quote. It says it's by an unknown person, but it's interesting. The quote says, "In life, you're either a passenger or a pilot. It's your choice." It's not too bad of a quote. I'd give it a B plus. I guess I'll leave you off with one more quote. It says, "When everything," it's from Henry Ford. He says, "When everything seems to be going against you, remember that aircraft take off against the wind, not with it." I guess something where chaos becomes the generator of order and order becomes the generator of chaos, kind of like the two hemispheres of the brain, in some sense, being present in the frontal lobe, I guess, like based on the neurological occurrence. Like as I'm speaking right now, I guess neurologically, it's the majority is the frontal lobe that's moving in the brain. Neurologically, but there are two hemispheres, which means fundamentally there are two urges. It's as if there is an kind of on and off switch to the sense of self. This on and off switch is very kind of unique because it's automatically a generation of intelligence. You got to get the fascination of like kind of an observer of design, and then your mind opens up. And then you have to also align to your own. See, the whole point of this and these talks is for people to pay attention to not just what's in front of their eyes, but where the light is going when it enters their eyes, in some sense. And the administration of free will. As Mr.Within says, the pilot of consciousness navigates as the whole plane of existence. Thanks for tuning in. Much blessings and namaste.